Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm looking at something rather unusual because I'm exploring a risk that we all face and yet probably don't think that much about. And that's the risk of getting burnt by a hot drink. Now that might seem like something that's very unusual, but as you'll hear on the show, it is far more common than you might think. And the dangers, particularly to children and the elderly, are incredibly high. And it's a really good example of a hidden everyday risk that can also provide some fascinating behavioural insights. The reason I'm tackling this subject is because I saw a post on LinkedIn where Kristina Stiles, a nurse, was asking Costa Coffee, that's a UK-based coffee chain that also has branches in 37 other countries, to reconsider an advertisement that she'd seen at a train station. The advertisement depicted a family lying in bed with a woman holding a cup of coffee. Where the marketing department saw a cute image, Chrissy saw the risk of normalising an activity that can cause life-changing injuries. I was fascinated by the idea that an advertisement, which obviously wasn't intended to encourage people to burn themselves or other people, could actually inadvertently do so. So I reached out to Chrissy to talk about the advertisement, and in doing so discovered that the risk of getting burnt is not only more common than we might think, but it's also a great case study for compliance in the wild. And in fact, I was so impressed at what Chrissy had to say and her passion for the subject that I just had to get her onto the show, and I'm delighted to say she agreed. So you are going to get some amazing behavioural insights from the way that Chrissy thinks about mitigating this particular risk, and some really useful practical advice for preventing people near you from getting seriously injured by hot liquids. There's also some really surprising advice for what to do if, or sadly as is more common when, a hot liquid burn occurs. I think you're going to be quite astonished by the techniques that Chrissy suggests for preventing long-term injury. Before we begin, my usual reminder that my book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance, is out now. There are links to that in the show notes. I really enjoyed recording this episode and I learned a tremendous amount, and I know you are going to as well. So please enjoy an absolutely fascinating discussion, jam-packed with advice and behavioural insights. It's Kristina Stiles on burns prevention. Chrissy, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you very much. It's really lovely to be here. I'm really looking forward to our discussions.
I'm really, really excited to talk to you. And to give people a sense of why that might be, can you tell them a little bit about yourself?
So I'm a burns and plastic surgery nurse by trade, and I've done about 15, 17 years working in the burn care. And I'm really passionate advocate for burn prevention, just because if we obviously didn't get burnt, then there wouldn't be need for burn services and there wouldn't be need to look after forensic aftermath of the burn injury. So I'm here today really with that kind of message in mind, that we want to do ourselves out of work, really.
Which is unusual because most people that come on the show are trying to they want their book read, they want their ideas spread. You're literally going, how can I reduce the amount of work I have to do? Because, well, frankly, what you're doing is not fun. And can you just talk a little bit about the sorts of, we'll come on to talk about the specific thing that grabbed my attention, but can you talk a little bit about the sorts of things you see? I mean, it's quite common for people to get burned in situations that you wouldn't think of, right? And these injuries can be very severe.
The injuries are severe. So really, majority of injuries that you would see across the burn services would be thermal in kind of their origin. So for adults, that tends to be flame-related injuries, so they always are quite severe. For children and your older generation adults, it tends to be scald injuries, so hot liquid that spills really is what's responsible for those, or maybe contact with hot surfaces. The trouble is, if you had a hot cup of coffee right now and you spilt it on yourself, yes, it will be a little bit ouchy. You're likely to get a little bit of redness on your skin, but it's very unlikely you would get any blistering or need to be admitted to hospital. Unfortunately, when we're very young, our skin is very thin, and when we're getting older, our skin thins with age. So that same cup of coffee that possibly you spill on the child, or if you're older, would cause blistering and would cause a much deeper injury. So that's the discrepancy. It's something that might not seem that hot to us as adults, actually is incredibly damaging to the young children and elderly.
And so really the risk profile shifts massively. And the interesting bit here is that the people who might be in control of the risk, i.e., those making the drinks, will not be vulnerable themselves. So there's sort of echoes of things like, I guess, viruses and things where people carry, may not, you may be asymptomatic. And I think there's an interesting thing there about the perception of risk as individuals. And so we have a view on things as we go around the world. And what you're basically saying is you may be right for yourself, but you may have miscalibrated the risk for other people, and that's the challenge.
Absolutely. So you asked me whether burn injuries happen in weird and wonderful ways. Actually, no, they happen in very predictable ways, and they happen in our safest places, our homes. Most burn injuries will happen at home, and with children especially, they will happen with adults present. So
Wow.
with your supervising, loving parent present, that injury can still happen. And that's why the prevention piece is so important.
And so let's talk about the thing that grabbed my attention, because you posted something on social media that was then in the way that social media, when it's wonderful, it does exactly this sort of thing. And it was a picture of an advertisement for listeners outside the UK, I think they're pretty big globally. It's a company called Costa Coffee. Had this advertisement of a family lying in bed with somebody holding a cup of coffee in the bed. It was sort of a cute image that I think is designed to say coffee's a fun thing for all the family, or whatever it was. Right? It looks artistically quite pleasurable. And you had posted and said this is really dangerous because actually what you're doing is promoting an activity that comes with a lot of risk. Can you just talk about the ad, why it's a challenge, and how you came across it?
So as I said to you already, that burn injuries happen in the homes. And of course, the advert showed a family laying in bed. Dad was sleeping. There were two kids in between two parents, and mum was laying on her back with a cup of coffee placed on her tummy, with children's feet and face right next to that cup. And as we know, it is not intentional. It is an accidental knock or a hit or a spill that then will result in this absolutely life-changing situation for families like that. And in the UK, at least, we have 30 young children every day. So that's, to put it into something conceptual kind of for you, it's a classroom of young children that gets burnt every day in the UK with a hot drink scald that needs to be admitted to a specialist burn service requiring reconstructive surgery, skin grafting. So the risk is massive, and the risk is something that we see how this inadvertent spill of a hot drink can completely turn around a family's life, and it will affect them for the rest of their lives. I have so many adults who are now adults who get in touch who say, I got burnt as a child and I still have scars to show for it. I still live with the consequences of that spill. I don't remember it. Or I have parents who'll get in touch and say, that happened to my child 2 years ago. They're absolutely fine. I can't get over it. It still replays in my head over and over again. Why did I do this? Why was I so silly? Why did it happen? How could I have averted it? So it happens. We know it happens. The reason why the advert flagged up that I saw red mist a little bit, I thought actually it normalizes this behavior that can be so risky and so life-altering for families in our communities. You saw it when you first saw it. You said, I probably wouldn't have paid much attention to it until you flagged it up. And I was standing at the station platform just looking at this poster. And it literally took a few seconds for myself as well for it to dawn, oh my God, what am I looking at? And it's so normal. Most of us would walk past it and not notice it. But obviously, I look at it with a very different burn prevention and burns knowledge eyes. And in my role as the Burns Ambassador for a Children's Burns Trust, the Children's Burns Charity, it's a very different thing. We end up supporting these families, for decades of their lives.
So you've seen this, and clearly your job is something where you're not going to be able to clearly you'll do other things, right? But it's going to be in the back of your mind, and so you're going to be alive to these things. So you've spotted this, and so there's this sudden realization that a company, and as you point out, right, this is not them deliberately going, how can we create a dangerous situation? You've got probably somebody in the art, this looks like a cute image, let's put it up there, and it'll help us sell more coffee, right? It's just very simple sort of marketing thinking. But without the knowledge that you've got, they've created something that on a subliminal, I'm not saying it's going to encourage people to replicate that thing, but subliminally, it's incredibly powerful.
Yes, absolutely. So it just plants that message that, we're all a coffee drinking society now. As a young mum, I also was meeting friends for coffee and cake, and the kids are playing under your arms as you're drinking coffee. And it's just a normal society behavior for us nowadays. Young mums will drink coffee or hot drinks around young children. But seeing those kind of images played out in front of you normalizes it. So it kind of makes it look like, well, that's safe. And maybe 9 times out of 10, nothing happens. And that is a very peaceful family scene, and children are asleep and mama's drinking her coffee, and that's perfectly fine. But 1 time out of 10, you will have that cup of coffee that unfortunately causes injury either to the parent or the children or both. And then, of course, we know the consequences. So that's why it's risky that we all do it. And all the time, nothing happens. It validates the fact that it's clearly safe for us to carry on with this behavior.
Right. And ever since we originally spoke, so I reached out to you because I was fascinated to join you on the show, and thank you for appearing. I've started to see this. And we were talking before recording that you can walk into any coffee shop and you will see people carrying their kids with a cup of coffee in a place that if you were thinking in the way you describe it, you'd be like, that's bringing two things close to each other that has a potential outcome that's not that uncommon, that's incredibly dangerous. And so once you start looking for this, it's everywhere, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad that it had that effect on you. That's the whole idea, for flagging it up to people who maybe wouldn't have normally thought about it. And of course, we all become parents without being taught how to be parents. So I'm this person, a bit like you, unaware initially about maybe the risks of hot drinks around young children. I have a baby. I normally would have drunk coffee, so I'll continue drinking coffee, holding my baby in my arms. And I have some numbers in front of me here, and 3,000 babies under 2 years old get burnt every year severely enough to be admitted to the burn service. So those are breastfed babies. Those are toddlers who just started to get on the move and explore the environment. So you exactly those situations. I saw on a very busy commuter train a mum who had a baby in a buggy and was passing a coffee to her mum across the buggy where the baby was sleeping. And you think, we're in a moving train, it jolts around all the time. And I'm just seeing, you kind of stand there silently thinking, I'm seeing this play out and thank God nothing happens, but potential is there. Or like the other day, I saw a mum with a baby strapped in a baby carrier on her chest, sitting at a coffee house, drinking coffee right over baby's head. Mums who breastfeeding, having coffee at home. It's the only peaceful time. Baby's quiet, baby's happy, baby's feeding. All of those are really risky behaviors. But how do we say to a tired, exhausted mum, don't drink coffee whilst the baby is quiet? It's the only time really. So I'm not really sure what the solution is necessarily. We always say, don't, put the drinks out of reach of children. Everything is out of reach of children. But ultimately, I'm there where the children are and I want to drink hot drink sometimes. How do I mitigate for the risk that this poses to my child? And I think it's not until that sometimes you open the new parents' eyes by telling the stories of the children who have got injured. And the Children's Burns Trust are fantastic in telling these stories, and certainly the ambassadors who are parents of the injured children tell these stories way better than me. But it's not until those times that it actually really makes the message land and makes you realize, oh my goodness, I'm a grandparent, or I'm a new parent, or I'm a sister, or I'm a niece, and whatever. You all of a sudden realize that burn injuries could be potentially all around us. And if you ask around your circle of friends or your family, somebody will know somebody who had sustained a burn injury. There will always be a story all of a sudden if you flag it up. So they are very present in our daily life. It's just people don't talk about it very often. And also we don't raise awareness in a similar way that we might do, say, for a heart attack or cardiac arrest, for example. Yeah, that we're very aware of this. Or the drowning prevention campaigns that are very prevalent. So burn injury needs to be way more present, I think, for us, because it's way more real. It's literally here in our homes.
And it's interesting you mentioned that, because I've got a story from when I was, God, I can't remember exactly how old I was, but I was on holiday with my parents in Norway and we were staying by this fjord. And I think I was old enough to be making my own cups of tea and coffee, where I made a cup of tea, literally poured it into my crotch, and then dived. I don't know why, instinctively dived into the field, which the doctor told me afterwards was exactly the right thing to do, because it obviously catered, the salt was helpful and everything else. But I remember that. But it's funny because it's only when talking to you that I suddenly went, oh God, that's happened to me. Now I was like, you would think, right, pouring in your crotch is not the best part of the body to put it on, but fortunately far enough away from anything delicate. And it was okay in the end. And I don't have any scars. But even having had that happen, I'm still in a position where, and it was a long time ago and I was a kid and whatever else, but it's not as vivid in my memory as that. And I think that's one of the interesting things is one, not obvious to us until we know something about it, even though it's common. But the second thing is, to your point, is it's in competition with a load of other risks that are out there. So when we sort of think about all the things that we warn people about, it's going to be smoking, alcohol, diabetes, and all these things about high blood pressure and so on and so forth, right? All these things are valid. And so you're in a space where you're having to compete with, I guess, it's a war for attention, really, in some respects, about all the do's and don'ts. And of course, it's not just that health messaging is the only messages out there. We've got advertising, which even if it wasn't being unhelpful, so it's quite tough for you in this space because, as you say, it's important. But how do we get people's attention in that wider information overload?
I mean, obviously, you don't want anybody to get injured. You don't want anybody to sustain a burn injury because, I mean, even from a slight sunburn, that's painful, really painful. Imagine a slightly deeper burn or a burn that then requires painful surgery. It's pain, pain, pain. And you want the person you care about, you love, to avoid all of that. You don't want any of that in your family at all. But yet they do happen, and they happen very regularly. So it's not until quite often that the parent becomes the parent of a child who's got injured, or somebody who's got injured through a burn injury, that they become the best advocates for the message of prevention and the best advocates for the first aid messages, which again, quite often, I mean, you mentioned about leaping into the fjord and, cooling yourself off. Many members of the public don't know what first aid is. And first aid for a burn is 20 minutes of cool running water within 3 hours of burn injury. So 20 minutes of cooling, whether that's, jumping into a shower or running it under tap water, even putting a cold compress, all you have is a clean scarf or a t-shirt and pouring some water on, placing it on. Anything like that, but doing it for 20 minutes is what's required to reverse the damage, to reduce the heat within the burn injury. Members of the public don't know this. They also don't know that first aid is effective within 3 hours of the burn injury happening. Yes, it's best immediately, but obviously if you're nowhere near where the water is available, although if you're in a home where most burn injuries happen, you should be able to just leap into shower, bath, tap. But if not, you have 3 hours to get the child or yourself to somewhere where there is running water that you can do the whole 20 minutes cooling. The trouble is, apart from the members of the public, the healthcare professionals also don't know what first aid is for burns. So quite often it's not done. They're not aware of the 3-hour window, that it's still effective, because after 3 hours is lapsed, the first aid is no longer effective. It will not reduce the impact. And by doing first aid, it doesn't just reduce the size and the depth of the burn injury. It also means that you might not need to be admitted to the burns unit. It might mean you don't need to have skin graft operation. You're less likely to have an infection in your wound, and you will heal much, much quicker. And that's free. This is free water out of the tap, mainly accessible where most humans are. So if you take anything away from today, it's if an inevitable happens, know what to do, because the first aider is already present at the scene, and it is quite frequently you.
It is amazing because, again, that feels slightly counterintuitive because there's two things I think are interesting. One is the 20 minutes, which I can imagine as you're doing it feels like an absolute eternity. Right? Your point is it's not scientifically that 90 minutes and 59 seconds is bad. 20 minutes, okay, and 20 minutes and 1 second is suddenly, too much, right? It's a rough approximation. But what you're basically saying is do it for a decent amount of time, and 20 minutes is rough. But that feels like an eternity. So that's challenge number one, which is it feels like, why I'm bored of this, right? It must be okay by now. But the second thing I think is really interesting is that 3 hour piece. I didn't know that. I knew that I knew the 20 minute roughly, but the 3 hours thing is interesting because, again, that's counterintuitive. So you've got two things here. One, I have to do it for longer than I thought might feel like doing or think is reasonable. And I guess if you're the person who's burned yourself, your sensation around is going to be a bit. But that 3 hour thing is really interesting because that gives you a window that is not obvious, because you would think I have to do it straight away or I'm screwed.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the two things you point out. So the 20 minutes can feel like a lifetime. And imagine that a parent who just witnessed a cup of coffee going over their toddler, and the child is screaming in pain. You're crying yourself, and you know that you need to put them in the shower, and the child is absolutely distressed. All they want is to reach for mummy and have a cuddle with the person that they love. And you know that what needs to happen is actually for them to be in that cool shower. A minute is going to feel like a lifetime. 20 minutes is a really, really long time with a distressed, wriggly child who is incredibly upset and in pain, but yet this is exactly what you have to do. And to your point that it might feel like a lifetime, I think quite often if you have a minor burn and you literally just touched something, and then you're putting it under running tap, I mean, none of us sit there for 20 minutes because you've touched an oven or an iron has fallen onto. But when it's serious enough, it either feels like this immense relief that because you're very hot and the burn continues to be hot and that heat is really unpleasant and painful, having cool water over it is a relief. It's like almost an analgesic. You're getting pain relief at the same time as you're getting cooling. So it's fantastic effect. And you need to have that in your head as a parent of an injured child, that just holding them there is actually doing them real good. It will reduce the impact of that burn. It will do everything it needs to do. Otherwise, without it, the clinicians are helpless to reverse the damage. You are there first. You need to do this. And the 3-hour thing, yes, like who would have thought? But there's been multiple studies published on this. And 3 hours is that efficacy window when first aid is still effective. So say you were with a distressed child and all you could do is 10 minutes. It's better than nothing, because when paramedics arrive, either they do the next 10 minutes or by the time you get to the child to the emergency department, they can continue doing first aid and complete it because that window still exists. But after that point, and if you haven't done any first aid, we see some really deep burns that then obviously require surgery, sometimes multiple operations. It's a skin graft. It always heals to a scar, and scars over time will tend to tighten and contract and actually behave in their own way. So whilst the wound may be healed, and the natural consequence of a wound healing is a scar. We all must have scars from where we've injured ourselves. But the scar tends to contract and tighten, and that poses a whole manner of problems and the consequences, especially if it's on a visible area or a functional area like the neck or a mouth or a hand, where actually having contracted immovable joints is not very good, or for quality of life purposes is really poor outcome for our patients. And we want to avoid that by advocating first aid. The knowledge of first aid, we need to get it out to our communities and to the people that we love. Even if you just told one person that you know really well, oh my God, did you know 20 minutes within 3 hours going to change the life? And it really will.
Wow. I mean, amazing stuff. And as you say, not what we would immediately think. And I think that's one of the interesting challenges, is that often in these sort of situations, we have to do something that might not feel natural, or we might not think not necessarily wouldn't feel natural, but we wouldn't necessarily get to it because we're, as you say, in a distressed state. And so there's something interesting here about planning around these events and knowing what you are going to do if, or unfortunately, when it happens, is got to be absolutely critical. So I guess a key part of your campaign is, and I'm always interested in the use of numbers as well in these situations, because you need something tangible. And so let's give it, if we think about hand washing at COVID, there was always a talk about how long do you have to do it for? Let's give people some metric. And so what I think is really helpful is you've taken something abstract, which is stick it under running water, and said, okay, here's some parameters that will really help. And if you understand those parameters, and one of those, as you say, is incredibly generous. I mean, 3 hours, if I said 20 minutes is a long time, 3 hours, that gives you lots of opportunities. And I think that's the really interesting bit here. So just planting that anchor with that number, I think starts to make this a bit more real, because then I've got something I can quickly grab, which is, oh, remember, yeah, that was the number. Good, that's I know what I'm doing now because I've got a framework around those numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. So the British Burn Association has produced the Cool Call cover. So those are the steps that you're meant to take if a burn injury happens. So cool, you obviously do the cooling for 20 minutes. Call, you call for help. You call 111 or 999 if it's an emergency, or your local GP if you just want to see them and check out. And then cover. And of course, especially if the burn injury is blistered, whilst you were cooling, potentially the blisters can burst, and that is normal. So especially in children who've got very thin skin, or in elderly, again, skin is thinner, those blisters will burst under the pressure of running water. It is normal. It is nothing to worry about. That's just how a burn injury behaves. But after you've done your 20 minutes cooling, of course, how are you going to get yourself to the clinician who can then assess your injury whilst you're waiting maybe for paramedics to arrive? The best thing is to cover it with cling film. Cling film most of us have at home. It's something that will actually cover the burn injury. So if it's blistered and the wound itself is exposed to air, it will be really stingy, very painful, still very burny, So if you cover it, actually those sensations subside and it feels less painful, less burny, because you've covered it up completely. It allows the clinicians to continue looking at the wound because obviously cling film or cling wrap is see-through. You don't need to keep removing whatever cloth or a dressing. So actually it allows assessment without trauma to the patient. It allows the paramedics to continue traveling with the patient without changing any dressings. So as a parent, as a member of the public, you've done your 20-minute cooling, you've called for help, and you cover with cling film, and that stays on until pretty much that patient will get to the burns unit. So these are very simple steps given to within the remits of everything that we're likely to have to our hand at home.
Wow. And that, I love that when you, because when I first sort of, heard that, I was just like, oh, that's interesting. That's you thinking what's domestically available, right, in the situation. But I love this. The see-through thing is genius, right? And again, wouldn't have occurred to me, but that's now planted a beautiful image in my head, which makes it easier to remember what it is in them. But that's fascinating. And I think that's a really, really good illustration of, okay, if we want people to do this, we're going to have to make this super simple, super memorable. And the vision of what have I got that's easily accessible? Because you're right. Chances are you're going to have that somewhere in the domestic environment and enough of it as well, right? It's something that we tend to have. So that's, wow, that's super, super powerful. And again, probably not the first thing you think of grabbing, right? You'll naturally think of towels or anything that's sort of almost thicker, maybe, I don't know. But that runs against the actual flow. But again, now you've pointed it out, really, really like simple.
To be honest, I think there are other options. So the British Burn Association will advise that obviously not everybody might have cling film at home, or the burn injury may have happened outside at the playing field somewhere or outdoors. So yes, a clean, non-fluffy cloth, because ultimately you don't want any fibers or any, cotton wool-like bits to end up in the burn wound that then the clinicians have to pick off, which is, again, painful. So you want something that's not going to leave a residue on the burn wound to be applied, ideally still like a wet compress. So I was mentioning maybe a cloth or a scarf or a T-shirt, something that's clean, not going to leave fibers behind. You can pour some water on that, place it on the patient. Clean sheet, paramedics sometimes might use a clean sheet. But normally, if paramedics arrive, they also will carry a roll of cling film. That's generally accepted first cover for a burn injury. And the see-through thing is fantastic. It allows us to continue on assessment. So it works really well. There is one other thing to say about cling film. We don't put it on faces, obviously, because obviously.
Right.
Yeah. So no faces. Faces we don't cover. Faces just are left open. For comfort, you can do the cold compresses to the face. But actually, faces will do really well without anything covering them. And it's a risk to an airway, to breathing, if you cover yourself in plastic to your face. So we just don't advocate there. The other thing that's risky with cling film is wrapping it all the way round. So say my arm got a burn injury on it. It's better to put on strips that are in the lengthways direction rather than wrapping around. Because any soft tissue injury, so any skin injury, will lead to swelling over time. And obviously, if you wrapped quite tightly the cling film around my arm, it tries to swell and it's got nowhere to go. And actually, that could cause trauma to the little blood vessels, which are trying to get your burn injury healed as quickly as possible. And actually, you're squashing them down and not allowing the nutrients and the oxygen to get to the skin. So not tight wrapping, very loose strips is all it is doing is just covering it to reduce the pain and to get that patient, your loved one, to the next clinician who can do appropriate assessment and put on a proper dressing.
Wow. Amazing. Well, phenomenal advice, really, and simple practical advice. And it's realistic and helpful. So thank you for all of that. I'm intrigued by what your views are, because I talked about, I walk around and now that you've pointed it out to me, I'm like, I went into a coffee shop yesterday and I was like looking for this stuff everywhere. And I feel like I've sort of got a new lens on things. It must be even harder for you because you can't say something to people, right? If they're copying, I'll put it loosely defined, copying the ad, right? Not literally, because you're not going to be in their bedroom, but sort of behaving in a way that advertisement would encourage. You can't do anything about it, right? Because presumably if you go up to people and say something, they're going to tell you to get lost. They're not going to listen to you. They might even continue to do it despite you. It's not going to be helpful.
It's a very delicate situation. You obviously want to encourage and advocate for burn prevention, But I think in that moment, quite often when you're correcting somebody's behavior, actually, like you said, the message won't sink in because they're just going to be fighting against some strangers who come in and butted into their very peaceful moment. Ultimately, nothing bad has happened. All you're talking about is potential for injury. So it is really difficult, which is why more of a public campaigns to say this is what could happen, or having the parents of the kind of burn injured children, or burn injured patients themselves and burn survivors speaking up about this is how it happened to me and I still live with the consequences, is actually way more impactful than someone like myself coming up to some poor parent who's trying to enjoy 5 minutes peace. And yes, okay, they're behaving not in the safe way, but we are surrounded, like you said, there's all this eat well, exercise often, don't smoke, don't drink. All of these messages are constantly bombarding us in our daily life. And if I add another one, be burns aware, and don't put any hot drinks near the children. Yes, I'd like to add that message, but it's going to go in one ear and out the other, because at the moment, for you, everything is safe and dandy, and it's not happened to you yet, and potentially might not ever happen to you. So, of course, your engagement in my message would be really possibly confrontational, but also you won't buy into it because it's irrelevant. And I actually found it as a burns educator that even approaching clinicians or professional services, it takes for somebody who's had burn injury in their lives to actually go, no, this is actually really important. We need to pay attention to this. We need to do something about this, spread the message or educate our staff or whatever it might be. And it takes for that advocate who's an insider within that organization for them to take that message on. And then they're way more powerful than me as an outsider could ever be. And of course, burn survivors themselves are probably the best way of getting that message across, because who else knows that inside out, the impact that injury can have. So it is really tricky to target members of public individually. You can watch in horror and obviously hope that they're not going to need you, and that at some point they will see your messages. I mean, the best way that I've now managed so far is just handing out the Family Oops books, which Children's Burns Trust host, and they're free books that are available, to educate little communities, little families about how to prevent burns in the home and what to do when the burn injury happens. There are these resources available that hopefully prod a little bit, and ideally prod the future generation of burns first aiders, those little toddlers who are just learning about the ways of the world. And I think the best way for families to learn is really around that reading piece, bedtime reading. I read to children every night. My kids go to bed, we read. And if you're reading the Family Oops story, you're all learning together. And we have so many examples of where children have done that. They've learned to read with their parents. And then the parents are a bit at a loss as to what to do when the burn injury happens. And the kids are the ones who said, Mom, this is what you do. No, it's not 10 minutes, it's 20 minutes. And they're
Right.
like these really bolshy advocates who are like, no, this is and they love it. They love being at the forefront of the knowledge that adults are a little bit lost. So this is what we want, is that new generation of first aiders who are growing up knowing the latest advocated advice for burns prevention and burns first aid.
I mean, it struck me as you were talking, and I love that idea of the kids kind of being the experts, right? Because again, that's like counterintuitive, but it's quite a great idea, right? Because they soak stuff up, and so if you can just get them to regurgitate whatever they've learned at the relevant point, then that's a super useful memory recall device that we can all benefit from. But I mean, as you were talking, I was sort of thinking, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when I look at sort of coffee bars and places where we drink coffee, and the home's one example, but I mean, those are dangerous locations. Because you're not going to be able to say to people, don't drink coffee ever again. I mean, it did occur to me that we could encourage people to drink iced drinks, which would presumably be safer. So if you're going to do something, maybe have an iced coffee rather than a hot one. Sounds like it's a safer thing to do. And at least you can then get your caffeine hit by the means. But I mean, it's even bring a kid into a coffee shop. You'll potentially because it's not just about your coffee, which obviously there's greater risk if you're carrying it above their head. But it's other people in that same environment. And if people are rushing in and out. So there's even some thinking around, if I am going to take a kid into a coffee shop, where am I going to sit, right? Is there a safer location for me to sit? Maybe by the door or by the counter, not necessarily smart. I mean, extra cognitive effort for people. But there's a whole load of things here that I just sort of thought. And I guess the challenge is that you've got people that want to sell coffee and in whose commercial interest it is to sell coffee. And hence they end up in that, well, we'll market this as family friendly, which is in essence what that ad is trying to do.
Now, look, you wouldn't get me to drink iced coffee for love nor money. So I am the hot coffee drinker. So, you have to work with the fact that that is going to be human behavior. We are going to go to coffee houses. We are going to buy hot drinks. And there will sometimes occasionally be children. This actually happened to me. My youngest, my son, was just turned 3. And we went to a coffee house to have a coffee and gave him a cookie to celebrate his birthday. So we were sitting having a coffee, and I just got mine served. And I said, "Oh, I forgot to have the hot chocolate on top of my whatever. Can you go and get me from the stand?" And it's like the special stand where all the sugars and the straws and the spoons, everything. So he totted off, being the little helper. And at the same time, another lady arrived at that point with a coffee in her hand. She did not realize that there was this tiny individual literally under her elbow. So as she turned,
You're not looking for
you're
it,
not
right?
looking for anything underneath you, are you? So she literally did what she did to her coffee and turned around, and her elbow hit his head, and the coffee spilled on his head. Now, she didn't realize because he stayed silent at the time. And sometimes kids do, like when the shock in the moment, they just literally freeze. And she continued walking to a table. I, of course, was watching this happening. He ran across, and as soon as he was with me, absolute burst into tears. This this gut-wrenching, scream.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, right. So I ran up to the till. I said, "My son just got burned. Can you please just give me some cold water? Where can I get?" So they give me a cup with ice in it and the J-cloth. I was like, no. Like the ice. And that's one thing we didn't cover, is that actually when we talk about cooling, ice is not the right thing. Ice can actually create a burn injury. It can create a frostbite injury. So we need a cool running water, not cold, something that's above 15 degrees, but basically something that's tolerable to your hand. Reasonably warm is still going to be cooling. So obviously they're staring at me. I go, "No, I need running water. I need some sort of just cold water." So eventually I get a cup of cold water with this J-cloth, and I sit there applying this to my sobbing son, with this woman continuing to drink her coffee, totally unaware about what happened. And of course, a part of me thinks, like, you must be aware there's a child crying, why they're crying. But she just continued, and I was so preoccupied with knowing what can happen now, because it was all his head, all his ear, side of his face, his neck, so I was preoccupied with treating him and just dashing off home to make sure that actually we've done all the right things.
Yeah.
Thank God he was fine. He was all right, superficial, and didn't need to go anywhere. But these things happen. Literally, people drink hot drinks. Around their feet will be young children. So the soft play areas that we all go to quite frequently will have coffee served right next to where the children are running and playing. So it is just really for the parents to be more mindful and more aware that as you're carting around a tray of hot drinks, perhaps having a lid on those drinks might, slow down the speed with which the drinks, because ultimately that lid on, especially the takeaway cups, it is going to go flying off. Like if it dropped onto a child's head, it would just come off. So whilst we think, okay, if I tipped it, then it won't come out, but actually if it dropped, it would still spill. So there are certain precautions that, yes, we're taking. So lidded cups is brilliant, but the best obviously is not to have hot drinks within the reach of children. So kids, especially toddlers, want to reach up and, you're drinking a drink they think is something yummy. They want to butt in. They want to get involved with it. "What are you drinking, mummy?" Or mums who are breastfeeding, it's so easy as you're drinking a cup of coffee or whatever hot drink for the child as they're feeding to pull on your hair. And all of a sudden that drink comes down. You weren't anticipating that, but it could well happen. So you just can't really plan for every little eventuality how these hot drinks can spill on the child, or how do these accidents happen, really? Yeah. But we need to be a little bit more aware, because if you're carrying a small child, just don't pick up a drink. So put the drink down, pick the kid up. They need to be two separate activities. And we've had children who were being carried by their parents, and a visitor had a hot drink and then bumped into the baby being carried, and then the baby got injured. So it still can happen. So maybe as parents, you just say, this is either a child-free zone, the area where the hot drinks are being served. And in our homes, it's a little bit easier to say, actually, kitchen is the most dangerous place in our homes. Majority of the burn injuries will happen either during food preparation or drink preparation, So just exclude children from that area, from the ovens, from the hobs, from the boiling kettle and the hot cups. That is an adult-only zone. It makes it simple. And the access to the young toddlers who are crawling, don't have low tables where you're putting hot drinks. Put them way out where they literally can't reach for them. So there are simple behavioral changes, but obviously it takes for you to make a conscious effort in your home to implement that. So there is much advice on the Children's Burns Trust available for all of us new parents and community members as to how to offset that risk of the burn injury happening in our homes. But normally, I think we know what the risks are. It's just being a little bit more mindful and conscious about, actually, I'm about to pick up a hot drink and there's this very interested baby who's crawling around, or a toddler who wants to get involved with me. Maybe I just separate the two.
I love that depiction there, because as I pushed you into the iced coffee zone as a suggestion, you were like, "No, I will not eat. I recognize this. I won't do that." Right? And then you move beautifully into that. We have to recognize the realities here, and so that chimes with something I talk about a lot, which is we need to think about the way people are likely to behave rather than the way we'd like them to behave. So ideally, we wouldn't combine children and hot drinks in any scenarios whatsoever, and that would make it safe. But you've rightly identified, and I love this because this is lost on so many people. And you'd have very good reason for kind of being fundamentalist about it, right? And going, we shouldn't have kids. We should just ban those two things, right? That would make your life easier in some respects. But you're just going, we have to recognize these things are going to happen, right? People are going to want hot drinks. How do we design interventions? And that's encouraging people to behave in the right way. Maybe that's the way we design things that make it less likely these things will happen. And I love that as a risk mitigation approach, because you're not sitting there. And we see this quite a lot with things like road safety, where we get people going, our target is 0 accidents. That is never going to happen unless you take humans out of the equation entirely. And even then, machines can have failings and whatever. So I love this fact that you're very practical and realistic about it. And you recognize that the risk you're trying to manage, the level of business that you have in your job, you're trying to bring down. But you're not saying, let's remove this thing entirely, right? But let's ban hot coffee, because you recognize that's not feasible.
No, I think we have to be very realist about it. And ultimately, a lot of NHS is driven by caffeine. So, we're very much powered by it. So, but there are solutions, actually. And you're right. Sometimes it is a design that's required. And sometimes it maybe is more of at a government level that the intervention is required. We saw this with the flammable children's garments, the fancy dress garments. So, obviously Halloween, we all have candles, the pumpkins, and children in fancy dress, which are synthetic materials that will just go up in flames. And we had the fire service who came on board, who also supported the Be Burns Aware prevention messages. And in the end, we advocated, actually, what we need is for children's pajamas, children's clothing in general, and their fancy dress clothing to be fire retardant. We can't have that. This is just a risk that we as parents, we as community just cannot have. It's unnecessary.
It's
risk.
unnecessary,
Yeah.
right? It's perfectly possible to make the clothes in fabric that's not going to combust, right?
Yes, and it exists now. So that's why we advocate, if you are buying a fancy dress clothing for your child, beautiful, have a wonderful time, but check that it's got CE mark, that it is actually fire retardant and it's quality made by the reputable producer, manufacturer. The other thing with the hot drinks, those takeaway cups, from environment point of view, not necessary. Why don't you bring your own cup, but have one that's designed and secure lidded, that actually, if you were to drop that mug, the lid stays on and it doesn't go anywhere. And that drink, the tiny little mouthpiece that might pop open, it might be a tiny little spill, but it won't be the whole mugful that goes on to you or the child. So have a well-designed mug. Test it out at home. If I drop this, even drop it without a drink in it. See what happens to that lid. If the lid doesn't come off, that's the right kind of equipment. So there are ways to offset us wanting to drink hot drinks around, our family members. And obviously, yes, the best thing is to exclude them altogether and separate children and hot drinks. But if the inevitable happens, people gather, people drink hot drinks, maybe have those cups that actually are way more secure screw lid that will stay on. So it's a call for manufacturers to, design it better to help us prevent burn injuries.
And I love that, because it's not. What's interesting about that is it's not incompatible with people recognizing that these disposable cups are not good for the environment, and we should be looking to other solutions. And so if we've got a world where we can plug into that. So you're not, what I loved about the way you talk about it is none of it is sort of, I'm going to prevent this thing from happening at all, right? And that, you're not fundamentalist on that side of it, but what you're basically saying is let's plug into things that we can easily do. And that's going to make the risk profile shift, right? It's not going to reduce it entirely, but we're going to move in the right direction. And so really working with the grain of other things that are going on, human behavior, how can we plug into that piece? And that's one of the reasons I want to talk to you is I think the way you talk about it is very behaviorally smart, because you're looking at what's realistic and what can we actually expect people to do who have other things to do, who are confused, who are tired, and particularly if they've got kids, they probably haven't had as much sleep as they want, going to need that coffee. How can we design those things? And so I love that idea of if we can talk about, let's make those cups that people are buying anyway, let's make them safer.
Well, let's talk about behaviors, because actually we talked about the adult behavior, but we haven't really discussed how children behave. And they will behave in unpredictable ways. And that age group under fives are the ones that are actually the majority of the burn injuries that we see across the UK burn services. 60% of all burn injuries will be children under 5. That's just quite a ridiculous number. Why are we seeing children who are getting injured? And it is because they will explore. So whilst one of the ways that the children will get injured is through when the food is being prepared, the other one is through exploration and play. So to them, they're just playing. They're seeing a shiny mug, but they don't know that it's a mug that holds a dangerous hot liquid. They just think that looks shiny and pretty, or it's a funny colour, it's got a picture on it, and mummy's always interacting with it. I want it too. So they'll reach for it. So children will reach for things that are just out of reach that they see their adults constantly interacting with. We say the same thing with the cooking on the hob. If you're cooking the hob, put the pan to the back hob so that and the handles turn to the back wall rather than up front where the child can reach for it and then the whole pan comes tumbling down on their head. So there are ways to offset it, but knowing how your child will behave, knowing that the child will want to come in where you are, and as soon as you open that oven door, if the child is standing by your knees, they will want to look what's inside the oven, or they might topple over. And, if they're unsteady and just learn to walk and they topple onto the hot oven door, it's really serious injuries that they can sustain. But you know how your toddler's going to behave. You know they're going to be nosy and want to be there with you. So it's very easy to offset, because actually, just excluding them from the kitchen when you're opening oven doors, or maybe when you're cooking with boiling pans, actually the easiest way for them to not ever get injured. It's unnecessary, so those kind of behaviors are important. And same with the elderly. We find that actually quite often, we find elderly who are living, especially when they're independently living on their own, maybe the partner's already passed and they literally are one person who lives by themselves. They're preparing hot food. Maybe their mobility and strength is not the same. As with age, we do tend to deteriorate a little bit. So we get a lot of cups of saucepans who maybe they drop and it goes down their legs, or cups of tea where they're holding it in their lap and they're sitting down, maybe drop off to sleep and it just tips into the lap, a bit like you did with your hot drink when you were young, and it just tips in. So these kind of things, we know this might happen. So, is there a way to offset it? Again, for the elderly person, maybe encouraging the use of a lid, so if it does tip, then that maybe actually it's not such a horrendous severe injury. The one thing that we are seeing more recently with the cost of living crisis, there are specific burn injuries that actually started presenting themselves to the burn services related to the fact that actually we're not wanting to expend energy in the home. So the gas, the electricity reduction in our bills. So stuff like hot water bottle injuries all of a sudden started going up. So, of course, I don't know what you do with your hot water bottle, but the advice is not to put boiling water into the hot water bottles. And of course, most of us put boiling water into the hot water bottle. And how old is your hot water bottle? Have you checked? Normally, the expiry date is at about 2 years. Do you replace your hot water bottle every 2 years? Do you check that the seal is still intact? And what happens is we keep pouring boiling water in, and then we either lay down on it because our back is sore, or put it with our feet.
Squashing it, right? Putting under pressure, right?
Absolutely. But either way, if it's 10 years old and you've kept it forever and ever, your old trusty hot water bottle, the seal goes off and it bursts, and all that boiling water that you've just put in there goes everywhere. And they're horrendous, deep injuries, because ultimately you might as well take water from a kettle and
Right,
pour,
right.
because that is the hotness of it that comes out. So we are seeing more of those as well. So I would say, A, check the expiry date on your hot water bottle. B, don't ever fill it with boiling water. Allow the kettle to stand for a bit. It'll still be warm enough to give the benefit of, what you're after, the warmth, but definitely don't fill it fully, expel the air, and mainly just check that it's in date. Until I started working in this field, I didn't really know that we had to check the expiry date of a hot water bottle, but it is there. And we all need to check, and likely yours is out of date and you need to get yourself a new present.
Wow. And as you say, what's interesting there is now you point it out to me. I'm like, well, of course that's going to happen. But it's that forethought. And I think as we're planning to mitigate these kinds of risks, we really have to start looking at, well, what's going to drive that human behavior? And I love the fact that you took us into what are kids doing, because you're absolutely right. We encourage them to be responsible. Parenting is all about let them express their curiosity, learn about the world. That's part of that's the right way to bring kids up, right? We don't want to, because don't telling them off all the time. Let them have that sense of adventure, whatever. And so, of course, they're going to, why are they suddenly not going to, probably that thing you're encouraging in that context. And so I think there's a lot of, when things have gone wrong, there's a retrospective. Oh, okay, I looked at that. So what we need to try and do, and I guess in your field, is to sort of predict, well, where's it going to happen next? And let's then get the preventative stuff around what might be obvious situations. And I think the whole water bottle is a great example. I mean, I don't have one, but I'm now going to check my parents, because I'm pretty sure there'll be ones that we're not talking 5 years old, right? They'll be for a long time. That's a really good point.
And back to the design of those, the one that I got gifted actually has this lovely kind of fleecy cover on it. But actually, I have to really scrunch up my hot water bottle into a tube to remove it out of the neck of that cover in order for me to inspect it. So from the design point of view, somebody's created something that's actually really pain in the backside for me to keep checking. Whereas if I had a proper one that maybe unzipped or had Velcro, you literally just are fast and faster. It'd be way
more likely that you'll do it,
from
right.
a human behavior point of view.
Right.
Absolutely.
Wow. As you were talking, there's one thing that occurs to me that we absolutely have to cover is, and we know where this has come from, which is, the warnings you get on coffee cups saying, caution, contents may be hot, which we know was driven from, I think, a legal case in the US of somebody who decided to put hot coffee, I mean, literally in their crotch, and then surprise, surprise, if you drive a car while you've got coffee there, things can happen. And so that's a very legalistically driven thing, right? Which is so that when they get sued, and particularly in the US, they can go, look, we point to. Personally, I find those things really irritating. And I think it's just because it's not helpful. No one is reading that. No one is paying attention. I am assuming you were of a similar mind that this is silly.
So I don't think it's silly to put it on there, to be honest. I think it should be there because the whole field of, burn care exists because we do have accidents as humans, sometimes it is doing silly things that we know we shouldn't be doing. But I looked after a chap a long time ago now, but he was convinced that he wouldn't get burned because he was using diesel to light a bonfire. And in adult, mainly men, we see flames, flame kind of injuries from accelerants being placed onto, they're trying to stoke a fire, they're trying to burn some wet leaves.
So these are these things that I see on social media where somebody is like pouring, you don't know what it is, but they're basically pouring a small amount of liquid on. That then ignites the canister that they've got. They throw the can, and there's all these sort of, I mean, they look funny, but they're really serious, where people have just caused infernos.
Yeah, so people do this. Yeah, so it does happen, and it is reasonably regular presentation. The whole kind of putting something flammable onto a flame, however small, even embers, will cause a very big whoosh. And potentially all the fumes that you are not able to perceive with the naked eye actually will then become flammable, and it's quite likely to be around your clothing, and then you'll be on fire. So it is really a dangerous moment. So a lot of the don'ts happen about don't put flammable liquid on a bonfire. So I do feel that we do still need to have those notices to say, it's hot, just be careful. But it's similarly, actually, it's not until I actually looked at the neck of my hot water bottle, it says, do not put boiling water in. And actually, a colleague of my emergency medicine consultant posted saying, is this the most ignored notice in the world? Because, so it's there and we all ignore it. So is there a point in having it there? I think it still is there, because when you have this revelation moment,
Right.
you heard Kristina Stiles on the podcast and go, I'm going to check out the neck of my hot water bottle. Oh, yes, it says not to put boiling water in it. I won't do that anymore. Let's hope.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's interesting because my gut reaction is it's wasted effort. And actually, when it's something that people, so the hot coffee one I find interesting. So I like better safe than sorry is your argument there, right? Why not put it on there? Because people
Yes.
look at it. So I guess the counter argument would be, it feels like a ridiculous warning, right? If I'm buying a coffee, logically, unless I've ordered an ice, the default is hot, and I specifically have to ask for iced coffee. So if I've got somebody patronizing me and treating me like I'm an idiot, the risk, I guess, is that you turn around and go, oh, screw these people. I'm not going to listen to any of their silly rules because they think I'm an idiot, and I'm clearly not an idiot, right? And so my argument is sometimes to say, if you do that, actually you undermine the serious messages because you look like it's come from the idiot's factory of patronizing messages. But it's a challenging one. I think you make a good point. And so for me, it's an interesting, well, what do we actually do? And I think that then comes back to saying warnings on its own is not enough. We need to start, as you were saying, we need to start thinking from a design perspective, and we need to think about the humans that are involved in it. And so the warning, if all you're doing is sticking that warning on there, that ain't going to cut it.
No.
Maybe it acts as an additional piece.
Yes, I think from an organizational point of view, the manufacturers, they're covering their backs, of course, because they've told you it is going to be hot or it's going to be unsafe if you behave in this way. We as humans proceed to ignore all of those safety messages and do what we're going to do. So again, it's the piece of, there is the human behavior, and we are going to behave in the way that we behave as standard. So how do we marry those two up? Because ultimately, there's me and my colleagues and, the people who work in the burn services and all other accident prevention, organizations who don't want people to get injured, and yet we will still proceed to behave in an unsafe way sometimes. One good example that kind of prevention message that possibly is not necessarily marrying up between the personal experience of individual and the organization is having a house fire. So I worked quite closely with the fire service, and their message is quite often, get out, stay out. If your house is on fire, there's a fire, you get out, we're on our way, we're coming. That's great, but I have to wait for you for 4, 8, 10 minutes whilst I'm standing outside and watching my life burning down in front of my eyes. So what we actually found, and a colleague of mine actually did human behavior piece where he went back to the people who have had house fires and just said to them, can you please tell me in your own words what was going through your mind, and why did you choose to go back into a burning building? And actually, whilst as an organization we're going, this is nonsensical. The building is on fire. Why are you going back? Like, why? Well, my pet was in there, or the only photos of my children who are on my laptop and I needed to retrieve that, or my passport, or something really significant to me as an individual that you just can't get your head around as an organization. But that meant for me that I was willing to incur minor injuries. Nobody would go, if it's fully ablaze, no one really would go back into that. But actually, you assess the risk because you can see it in front of you. And people who've gone back in sustained minor burns, but they were happy to do so to get what was that emotional piece, that emotional link to them was important to them. So as an organization, you'll be going, no, get out, stay out, you mustn't go in. And as a person, you go, well, you know what? That's important to me. And I need that. I need that in my life. I can't stand here watching my house burn down. So you're trying to marry up the organizational kind of protective messages and then the personal experience. How do we meet those two together and make it happen so that the person actually feels heard and understood why they behaved in that way, and not chastised after the fact of why on earth did you do this stupid thing and go back in and now you're injured, look at you, because actually their decision-making was perfectly sound.
Based on the inputs that they had, right?
Yes.
Which is, this is important.
Yes.
And therefore, so even if we don't understand it, there's an emotional logic to it, right? Which is, I need to achieve this objective, I'm going to go do that. And so the risk calculation isn't the one that we are judging them by, right? It's a completely different. Now, we might not agree with that. We might think it's silly, but nonetheless, from their perspective, there's a reason for it.
Yes.
And I think that's a really powerful thing. We often kind of go, why has that idiot done that? And of course, there are people that make idiotic decisions, and some people don't have the mental capacity to fully think about things, but very often, and more times than not, there will be some reason why they're doing it. And so if we can put ourselves into their shoes and try and understand that, we'll get a better sense of why it's happened. And that actually, I think, to your point, also helps us think about what other people might do.
Absolutely. So it's really important to understand that we're all humans and we're all emotionally driven. The whole life for us, every daily life is based on emotion. You're happy, sad, whatever. The whole rainbow of emotions that we experience. And when it comes to injury or accidents, it is a hugely emotional situation, very emotionally charged. So when it comes to a parent whose child just got injured, they might present to the paramedics as really aggressive, angry, confrontational, but actually all it is fear, and it is worry for the person that you love the most. And actually, once you dampen that down and we're here to support and to help, all of that anger dies down, and actually they're there on your side and you can get them on side. The best thing for parents to do is to get in the shower with the child, for example, because the child calms down, they get in a cuddle with the mum and dad, and they're having a shower together. They're way more likely to allow that to happen than the stranger who comes in a really odd uniform and is starting to prop you under running water, drowning you under this water stream.
Right.
So
And you've told me to stay away from strangers, right?
yeah, so once you get the parents on side and you break through the natural human response to these situations, actually, once you meet them with understanding, I know exactly what you're going through. I'm here to help. This is what will really help you in the long term. Let's just do this now. We're going to do it together. We're going to go through this together. It's the only way. You have to meet your patient, your community member, the person you love, with an understanding.
One of the things that I've noticed on social media is that we get lots of interesting challenges. We can think of things like the ice bucket challenge, for example. Presumably, we get people doing crazy things that are unhelpful to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly with the advent of the social media and how popular it is, especially amongst the young adult population, they tend to be a bit more risk takers. So there certainly is a following. So it might just take one person to do something absolutely incredible. Like, for example, the asthma inhalers that you have, and the air that comes out of those is actually incredibly cold. And we had kids who were pumping the inhalers onto their skin, creating frostbite injuries, and some were doing it like a band around their wrists, so they would then present to the burn service with quite horrendous frostbite injuries. And we were getting all these kids through with the same kind of injury across the UK, and you're thinking, what's happening? And then it kind of narrowed down to the fact that there was some influencer or somebody online that suggested, oh, look what I can do. And then of course, the young adults, they thought, oh, I'm going to try that. I'm going to see if that's true, if I can actually do it on me. So a little trend, a little silly behavior like this can actually result in masses copying that behavior. Again, if it's a risky behavior, copying the risky behavior and then ending up as a presentation to the burn service. So it can take just one good influencer who potentially could promote our burn prevention, be burns aware messages that completely changes the game for us in the burn prevention field. Or it could be something like this where somebody just says, oh, look, I could just pump something onto my skin and create this wound. Doesn't it look cool? Did you know that? And then hundreds and hundreds of kids basically trying to copy that behavior. So this can be quite a revelation, and it certainly is a new behavior that we're seeing in the burn services that previously we didn't have to contend with. If you didn't have social media, we possibly wouldn't see half of the injuries that we're now seeing. But the bonus is obviously that we can also share the messages much more widely, and it makes us way more accessible to the public as well.
Before I let you go, and before we point people in the direction of useful resources, I want to say one thing to you, which is if you had a message for Costa Coffee, what would it be?
I'm available for coffee and chats about how we can incorporate burn prevention messages very neutrally, very subliminally into your future campaigns. It is really important, the impact that the burn injuries have on our most loved humans in our lives. And you have a really powerful message that you are able to deliver very subliminally, very obviously, and globally to the whole of the worldwide. I would love to meet you in the middle. Let's have a coffee. Let's talk about it.
Wow. We'll put that out there as a clip and see if we can get it to them and get them to engage on this subject. Kristina, thank you so much for sparing the time, all the things that you're doing to not, I mean, what you do from a medical perspective is important, but I think the way that you're engaging with the subject and thinking, how do we stop this from happening, I think is praiseworthy, behaviorally smart and really interesting. And I've learned a whole load of things. The practical tips that you gave us are all useful. So just give us a quick top tips for either preventing or dealing with burns.
So most of the burn injuries that happen in our safest places, in our homes. So preventing burns are mainly preventing hot liquid scalds in our homes. So wherever you're working with boiling water, hot pans, hot oven doors, running a hot bath, it's really important that you separate your young family members away from those areas. But if the inevitable does happen, it's 20 minutes cool running water. It is still effective within 3 hours of the burn injury. Make sure you don't let that time lapse. Cool, call for help, and then wrap gently, loosely in cling film or a non-fluffy clean cloth. Here for you.
Amazing. And of course, you don't want to be there for them because you want to stop it happening in the first place. But if it does, it's an absolute relief to me. And every time I speak to people in your line of work, I'm always tremendously grateful because I know that what you do is tough and you work long hours, and there's all the challenges that have been publicized around the work that you do. So I want to say on behalf of all of us that are cared for, particularly people that have been in your care, I hope never to be there, but I know that if I am, I'll be in very, very good hands. So thank you for all of that. But above all, incredibly enlightening. Before we finally finish the show, right, tell people where they can get more resources and anything else that you want to promote in terms of charities and anything else people need to be aware of.
So I am an ambassador, as I said, for the Children's Burns Trust. So for any families affected by burn injuries or children with burns injuries, there are many resources available on the website for the Children's Burns Trust. There is also the Family Oops and Burns First Aid book. That's a free resource that's available to anyone who's interested, who wants to educate their future generations of first aiders. And for adults who possibly are affected by burn injuries, there's also Dan's Fund for Burns, and there is the Katie Piper Foundation, who are two amazing burns charities that support families and adults affected with burns.
Links to all of those things are in the show notes, people that didn't have a pen or a keyboard to hand. But Chrissy, all that remains for me to do is to say thank you so much for being an amazing guest on the show.
Thank you very much.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Chrissy for appearing, and of course to her and her colleagues for all the sterling work that they do in very, very challenging circumstances. I also want to thank you for listening to the show, and if you want to find out more about Chrissy, the work that she does and the charities that she works with, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. You'll also find links to my book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, thank you so much for joining us. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe. If you are drinking a hot drink, maybe have a little think about where you put it and how you drink from it. Could well prevent a serious injury. Thank you so much ever for listening. I really do appreciate it. I'll see you very soon on the next episode of the show. Bye for now.